IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. My name is Rohan Seth, and I have with me today Prateek Vagre and Atish Padi. We are here to talk about something that's actually been on the news since January, but seems to have fizzled out a bit recently. See, when Twitter and Facebook removed Donald Trump from their platform, it started a whole conversation on whether or not deplatforming was actually an effective method of moderating speech, and if there were better methods available. See, because whether deplatforming is effective in moderating extremism or just temporarily drives it out of view to intensify and potentially cause even more harm is a bit of a debate. And in this podcast, I think we're going to try and look at different solutions or different methods of achieving similar goals. So, Atish, let's start with you. Can you give me a little overview on what broader ways, what maybe better ways there are to manage harmful speech?
So there are many problems, as you identified, with how these platforms operate and the kinds of speech they allow. So in my reading and what I've come across is there are many different ways that these platforms themselves have adopted in trying to regulate them, right? So, for example, they are trying very hard to bring in new automation tools that automatically identifies harmful content that they can take down. Then there is this phenomenon of them creating their own legal standards with, like, you can call it Twitter law, Facebook law, or whatever, where their own community standards are the law of the land within that platform, and whatever violates it is taken down. Now, a lot of people do not think that is a very good way of regulating speech, because a lot of speech that is legal in under the constitution of different democratic countries is pushed offline because it does not abide by the community standards of a particular platform. And in the United States, for example, there has been a lot of attempt at labeling a lot of the speech that is removed as being biased against conservatives. So conservatives are censored according to a lot of them. On the other hand, there are approaches being taken where they are trying to mandate these platforms as public spheres of some sort, such that you will have to retain every single piece of content that is out there, so that no sort of speech can be removed. And that also comes with its own set of implications, right? And there are also related problems that come from the problems that social media companies and platforms present go beyond speech regulation also, right? There are problems of competition, which are also many are trying to solve through antitrust and by breaking up a company. Those are some proposals where you say that a company like Facebook or Google should be broken down so that, say, YouTube and Google search are separated, for example. And that is an approach that is happening on a company level, which ignores the fact that a lot of these products have monopolistic power or are as dominant as they are, not simply because they are part of a big company, but also because of the inherent network effects within it. So you need like more of a specific product level intervention in order to ensure that such anti-competitive practices are stopped, or that there's better competition happening. So I think Prateek identified a lot of good approaches that fall in between these two extremes, where on one end, for example, you have Twitter law or community standards being the way in which you regulate content and on the other hand, you have something like no content should be taken down. And these in between solutions are, he refers to them as unbundling by different names, because all of them are very similar in their approach, where they try to unbundle many different features that platforms so far are packaging as one. So today, I think we'll be discussing all of these unbundling structures bundled together. And I'm sorry if you're going to make that joke later, Pratik, but a lot of them are very similar, and we'll be looking at how they are different from each other in subtle ways. But the broader question is how these approaches might be more effective than just looking at it within the binary of removal of content or keeping it up.
Can I also just add that Pratik, of course, has an excellent newsletter that is called Miss Dismal Information. It's of course subscribed by and read regularly by everyone on this podcast. But this time he talks about methods like magic APIs, protocols, not platforms, comparative compatibility, middleware, and so on. And these are all fascinating solutions. Their second order effects are even more fascinating. So Pratik, this podcast is sort of tailored for you. So tell us why they are different. And yeah.
Yeah, no, and just to add it, I think the phrase unbundling is not something that I coined. I've borrowed it from Daphne Keller, who proposed the Magic API solution, right? And yeah, so and to take a step back, right, essentially, as Atish said, right, these proposals sort of fall in between the various approaches you have today, and try to address some of the contradictions that you have between free speech and competition, right? Because you want to ensure that you want to ensure that the marketplace is competitive. You want to ensure that all harmful speech is taken down, but you also want to ensure that people's freedom of expression is not affected, right? And that's where these approaches sort of come in and approach it from different perspectives, right? So the first of these is called Magic APIs, which, as I said, proposed by Daphne Keller, and she sort of approaches it from the perspective of telecommunication unbundling requirements, right? And just to quote, I think the relevant line, which is the idea is to insert competition in markets which are subject to network effects by requiring incumbents to license hard to duplicate resources to newcomers. And you take that approach and you extend it to platforms, right? To your Facebook, Twitter, etc. And you're basically, in a sense, telling them to make their the information, their data, etc., that they have available to newcomers in the space, right? And the way you potentially go about doing that is you'll have to build out APIs, and this is a complex process technically. Hence, they would be magic APIs, right? I think that's where that's where the term comes from, and it throws up a lot of questions, right? And I think we'll get into that. The other solution is posed by Mike Masnick, who's the founder editor of Tech Dirt, right? And this is called protocols, not platforms. And the idea here is so the vision, right? That he had was essentially to take the internet back to its earlier days, where it operated mostly on different protocols rather than centralized platforms, right? And the approach here is to unbundle things to the extent that in its most ambitious vision, right? Things would be unbundled to the extent that users have access to their own data stored in blobs, right? And then different services are able to access this and offer you services on top of that, right? So it's sort of like moving away from your centralized monolithic platform that we have today and into different protocols that interact with each other, right? So in a sense, you can think of it as tending towards the decentralized web, right? At least that's how I interpreted it. Then the third one is competitive compatibility. I guess you can call it artist formerly known as adversarial interoperability. And this is something that Cory Doctorow has been talking about a lot as special advisor to the EFF. And in this case, right, the approach is it's at two levels. So at one level, you're saying you're asking for for there to be mandates for interoperability, so that companies have to make sure that your larger platforms have to make sure that competitors are able to plug into them and use their platform to offer adjacent services as such. But he also makes the distinction that the interoperability mandate should not be the ceiling, rather it's the floor. It's the minimum that's required, and the ceiling should be it should be removing any sort of anti-circumvention mandates that a number of laws have, and I think this is still largely US centric. I'm a little unsure of how this plays out in the legal in the legal context in India. But since we're talking about global platforms, it's worth exploring. And the fourth solution is middleware, and that's been proposed by a working group on platform scale at Stanford University. And Francis Fukuyama has written about this extensively as well as part of that working group. And middleware, it borrows from, the term borrows from the OS operating system concept of a middleware, which is essentially offering a common set of services to, in that context, it says to offer a common set of services to enable functionalities that an operating system may not have. In this case, again, it goes back to the whole unbundling approach that Atish also referred to, which is essentially like saying, look, you're on Twitter, but today there's just one algorithm on Twitter, and Twitter decides how to sort your feed. Yes, you can sort between a reverse chronological and a algorithmic one that's tailored to your interest, but that's basically it, right? And in the middleware solution, similar to the other solutions, the idea is that you have a different bunch of, I guess, operators, providers, you call them whatever you want, also giving you the ability to potentially moderate your content in different ways, right? To filter your content in different ways, and again, not all of them restricted just to your feed sorting, but also to things like who you'll be able to follow, etc., and things like that. So and essentially, right, the idea is you're looking at you're looking at all the functions that social media platform offers you today, and you're saying, okay, who controls this, right? It's the platform itself. And what these solutions try to get at through different approaches is trying to take the central element of platform control out of that, and essentially open that up to other people or to other providers or operators, etc., who can then, I guess, differentiate it for end users.
Okay, I must confess, I feel obligated to talk about Twitter Blue Sky over here, if only because this seems a little bit in the same lane. So can you talk about let's explain what Twitter Blue Sky is first. And then could you talk about how it's different from the solutions that are being proposed?
So Twitter Blue Sky actually is not significantly different, right? And in fact, now I haven't gone through the technical proposal of that, but and Jack Dorsey referred to this last in one of the quarterly earnings call. But the approach is similar in the sense that they want the ability so that for the algorithm to be your feed to be sorted by different algorithms, right? Not just Twitter's centralized approach that is today. I think it's still very much in its early stages, and and if I recall correctly, in one of the Twitter threads that Jack Dorsey did about it, he acknowledged, I think, the protocol, not platforms approach also, right? So it seems to be it is certainly inspired by a number of these approaches, but yeah, and while it is operated by, and I think it's being worked on by an independent set of engineers right now, funded by Twitter, it's certainly interesting to keep an eye out for. But at this point, at least, I am looking at it as as a Twitter solution, right? As opposed to these others which are not solutions by a specific platform. But yeah, I think you're right to bring that up as something that we should keep an eye out on in parallel.
Also, Prateek, I wanted to talk about how a little bit of difference in these approaches in the sense of who they are intending to target, right? And you identify this in your newsletter also. So it seems to me that the Magic API, the middleware, and the compatibility one are, even though they do not explicitly maybe mention the big tech companies, they are more concerned with the bigness aspect of it, right? And are concerned with the fact that these companies have neo monopolistic power and there is not enough competition. But something like the protocols not platform is a much more universal vision where the author is arguing that we need to go back to we need to make a very fundamental shift in the way we think of the internet, such that we go back to the internet as it used to be, and therefore this would apply even beyond these big companies. And I think that's where also this blue sky conversation becomes interesting, because Twitter is in fact doing this in order to maybe compete against Facebook, because Facebook is much, much larger than it. So is that a fair distinction to make? And also on the basis of how deep they go in regulating, on how deep they go in whether or not they're regulation based. Because once again, I think here protocols, not platforms, is entirely a tech first market driven solution, while the others seem to rely more or less on some sort of regulatory handling or some sort of legal backing where the state has to get involved in some way. Are those fair distinctions to make, Pratik?
Yeah, I think you are right about that, right? In terms of the regulatory approach, I think that is spot on. Although so I think in the case of competitive compatibility, it's fairly obvious, right? It explicitly says that there needs to be a data protection law to mandate that when you open these up through interoperability requirements, that the data is not abused by anyone, right? And you need to have a data protection mechanism or regime in place. And also in the sense that, look, if you want to do away with anti-circumvention regulation, then you have to go and amend existing laws and make sure that they're written in such a way that they can't be gamed, right? They can't be gamed, which any self-interested large corporation is likely to do. Right? I think that's just how they'd approach the world, right? In the case of Magic APIs, yes, I think she does draw a reference to the telecommunication requirements as well, right? So there is certainly that approach of regulation. In the middleware approach, they're a little more. I think they're more interested in the fact that you have this ability to make these different providers function on top of a platform. They're not necessarily concerned with how you get there, right? If regulation is required, yes, go ahead and do that. If the platform themselves open up to an extent where they allow this to happen, yes, go ahead and do that, right? But they've not explicitly advocated for regulation. They seem to be more interested in the means, in the ends rather than the means.
Right. Yeah.
All right. Can we talk about Facebook a little bit here? Because of course, Twitter and Facebook have very different platforms, have a bunch of different user bases. How does this? What is the second order effect of maybe the Magic APIs, and how does that sort of impact Twitter differently, and how does it impact Facebook differently? So Magic APIs are basically licensing hard to duplicate resources, right, to newcomers in the market, so that network effects are not a problem. Now, of course, Facebook licensing its APIs is, I guess, network effects. I'm not sure I have this question right, but their network effects are harder to beat. So even if they license the API, what exactly does that mean? Does it mean that people can log on to their own website and have Facebook's network with them? Or does it mean that, I don't know, that people can log on to Twitter's website and have Twitter's user base, but be using a different app? Does that make sense in any way?
Okay, yeah, I think I get it, right? And again, so it's important to consider that, okay, look, all these solutions, the proposals are not meant to be mutually exclusive, right? They will overlap in some ways. In some cases, they complement each other. So without restricting specifically to one type of proposal, I think none of them exclude that possibility, right? I think they're all open to the sense that, so the end goal is basically to wrest away control of what you do on these social networks from the social network itself, right? Now, whether it is that you log into Facebook and you have a whole bunch of different versions of Facebook to choose from, on Facebook's portal itself, or you have the ability to go to a completely different provider that's then tapping into your Facebook graph and providing you either the same set of services or building on top of that. I think none of them explicitly either include or exclude those possibilities. But the central idea is essentially to say that, look, we're in a situation today where these platforms have complete control over what you see, right? And there are these conflicting requirements on them. One, to address harmful speech. Yet we know that just deplatforming, right? As you introduce this conversation, right? As just deplatforming one particular user or a group of users or people who believe in one particular conspiracy theory does not completely eradicate that belief, right? Those things still remain. So it's about then trying to find that balance between competition and free speech. Right? That's ultimately where they all come to.
So this brings me to the privacy concerns that arise from adopting one or maybe more of these solutions. So Pratik, Atish, talk to me about which one of these is the most privacy focused of all solutions, and how this impacts privacy differently from the status quo.
Yeah, so from what I understand of these approaches, it seems that something like competitive compatibility, which explicitly mentions that you need to have some guidelines, and they say a federal privacy mandate, which no one can be allowed to break, either existing big players or players trying to make their systems interoperable, right? And similarly, in the Magic APIs section, also Daphne Keller explicitly mentions that there seem to be many privacy concerns with it, because the example that she gives, in which the content of Facebook content, which is legal, will be shared across different platforms, that by itself raises big privacy concerns. So these two are rather clearer, while the other two approaches, like protocols, not platforms, and middleware, is a little more difficult to predict on this basis, because they don't explicitly mention privacy or what laws there should be to protect privacy. So I think those two are more difficult to gauge out.
Yeah, and if I can add, right? So I think in the protocols, not platforms, the most ambitious version of it, the idea is that every user will have their data in their own blobs, right? So that a platform will need to specifically request for access to it, or any of these other providers or operators building on top of the platform will need to request access for it. So in that sense, trying to put in ultimate control in the hands of the user, right? In the middleware approach, again, as Atish mentioned, I don't think there's a specific reference, but my inference, right, based on reading that is, and since they mentioned that with this approach, platforms will be able to retain their current business models. My inference is that they seem to take a more status quo approach than the other, right? In Magic API, I think Daphne Keller, she does highlight some of the issues that will bring up, right? And the more fundamental questions of data ownership, right? Which is if you like your friend's post on Facebook, who owns that data? Is it your data? Is it your friend's data? Right? Is the contact information that or your friend list? Is it your data? Is it Facebook's data? Is it your friend's data, etc.? Right. So these questions, it'll throw up these challenges, right? But I also think we're at a point where we anyway have to answer these questions as part of any sort of data regulation regime we enact, and how it will build on over the years. I think these hard questions are something we'll have to tackle and get to anyway.
Right. And Pratik, there are also other concerns with these four approaches, right? For example, from my reading, most of these approaches do not also explicitly mention how the business model will work, because these are rather fundamental changes, and they will mean that the companies will have to change their business model significantly. But those are not explicitly mentioned. Is that a correct reading?
No, to some extent they are, right. They are, and look, so that remains that's certainly going to be one of the challenges, right. I think in Magic APIs, Daphne Keller refers to the complication that a revenue sharing model will invite, because how do you split revenue over ads in this context? That's going to be a pretty thorny issue to get by. In the competitive compatibility one, yes, I think there's no specific prescription. I think in middleware, they talk about potentially a revenue sharing, or even one of these middleware solutions themselves, either offering themselves as a subscription based service, or then serving ads, right? Which again, you have to question then what that does for underlying incentives in that sense. Protocol nut platforms is fairly interesting. I think he acknowledges, Mike McNamee acknowledges that the problem with the protocols of the earlier years, and one of the reasons they sort of faded into the background, was the fact that they didn't have a business model, right? And I think he comes at this from two ends, in the sense that if users have their data stored in blobs, then there could be a reverse auction type mechanism, where these different protocols are bidding for access to that data, or different protocols or platforms are bidding for that information. But again, you don't know that doesn't address the question of how those services themselves will generate revenue. One of the other things that he talks about is potentially taking a token-based approach, right? Analogous to your cryptocurrencies, where the protocol itself has a token associated with it, and then as more people use a particular protocol, the value of the perceived value of the token rises and its valuation rises. But that remains, I think, a challenge, right, across all these approaches, because if it's revenue sharing, then there is still a dependency on platforms, right? And if they're trying to serve their own ads, then again, some of the underlying incentives of trying to collect and harness user data don't change, right? In fact, you're splitting them across a wider set of actors, essentially.
Right. And finally, in your newsletter, you also identify some of the broader questions that arise from these. And one that I found very interesting was how some of the larger structural problems that result in many of the side effects that we witness from social media proliferation, like misinformation and the anti-information disorder phenomenon, or other problems of hate speech that arise. A lot of these structural problems are not addressed. Would you want to throw some light on that?
Yeah. So again, that's my interpretation, right? And as you said, right, the issue that we have in the information ecosystem today is not limited to platform, right? It's an interplay of how people consume information, how news media themselves report, amplify certain types of content, how political actors play a role in it, right? So all of these play together, right? And to some extent, Kate Starbird calls this the participatory disinformation model, or what she used to earlier call disinformation as collaborative work, right? But again, if you take it just outside the context of just disinformation, which is coming in from an intent perspective, just in the fact that look, there are these skewed incentives all over the information ecosystem, right? It doesn't it may any of these approaches will not address all of those. And to be fair, none of them are actually claiming to being able to address all of them. So I think we have to give all of them that, right? None of them are claiming to solve all these problems, but those are things that I think we as specifically as policy thinkers need to think about, as society, that we need to approach. There is one specific problem, though, and one criticism that a lot of them have, that these solutions have got, is that look, if you're creating essentially these specialized algorithms that people will use to sort their feeds, there is a potential to make to worsen the filter bubbles that we have right now. Again, there is a lot of debate on the strength and the influence of filter bubbles, but you can force you can to a reasonable degree predict that users may self-sort themselves based on certain types of content that they may want to consume, and that remains a challenge. I think most of them take the view that in a non-centralized system, some of this will be so diffused that it ultimately may not matter, right? I don't necessarily share that optimism, but it's also you also then have to look at it, compare it with the existing binary, which is either leave everything up or take everything down or deplatform them, which is where the conversations are today, or whether we can try to explore solutions somewhere in between, right? And which is essentially what they're doing.
Yeah, and similarly, one of the other things that I think should also be mentioned is to what extent these solutions and other solutions that we regularly discuss affect the most, in my view, the most pernicious effect of many of these platforms, which is the behavioral changes it makes in us, right? So the extent of addictability, as someone that is on social media half the day, I can say that is one of the problems that I think is the most fundamental, and yet it is one that it is not clear how you can solve them through any of these approaches or through any policy approach at all. And I think that also needs to be discussed very much.
All right, great. Thank you both so much. I think this has been a fascinating conversation. We will, of course, catch you in the next one, dear listener. And thanks, Prateek and Atish, for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Cred and Thea. Thank you so much for making this possible. We've had an amazing week on the network. Do check out The Note with Mahrukh Inayat. She speaks to Prabhat Kumar, the man leading child protection at one of India's leading NGOs, Save the Children. On The Habit Coach, Ashton was joined by Rajat Mittal Shah to talk about some superfoods in Ayurveda like turmeric and ashwagandha. On Paisa Vaisa, host Anupam Gupta has a digital gold special in 2 parts, one with Ashraf Rizvi, founder and CEO of Digital Swiss Code, and Gilded, and one with Deepak Appet, co-founder of India Gold. Listen to the first part of the Father's Day special of Agla Station Adulthood with Natasha and her father, Dr. Vipul Roy Rathod. You should also check out Cyrus Says' episode with Mukul Chadda. He talks about upcoming shows Sunflower and Sherni. Our Kannada podcast, Thale Artist, celebrates 100 episodes, and we had a reunion of hosts Pawan, Ganesh, and Surya who shared their favorite moments from the past. Shiva Mehta is back with the second season of Smile India. The show is available in both English and Hindi. On this episode, she talks about the conversion from bag teas to bagless ones and how we should ditch the plastic and have a great tea experience. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Come learn and experience the ABCDs of being queer with me, Shunetro,
and me, Farhad,
on our show, Gay BCD.
The two of us take you through our stories and experiences of being gay men in the city of Mumbai and have candid
and sometimes downright scandalous
conversations about sexuality, gay culture, and everything in between.
Catch new episodes of Gay BCD every Tuesday on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get all your podcasts from.